The biggest risk in digital advertising from AI is probably not the one that most people are talking about. It's not job replacement, it's not creative generation, it's what happens when autonomous systems start making commercial decisions without clear ownership, governance, or accountability. The following is my talk from Programmatic.AI in Las Vegas, where I was one of the only speakers to tackle the subject head on. Because frankly, in our industry, people like chasing opportunity much more than they like talking about how to manage risk. And frankly, we struggle with everyday business risks: pricing risk, operational risk, governance risk, and incentive risk. But AI dramatically changes the stakes. And if we don't start building the right control layers around these systems right now, we're only going to recognize the consequences once they become very real. And one of the reasons that this is always on my mind is due to a class I took that was literally a life-changing class when I first came to America. I had the opportunity to do a class with Ronald Howard at Stanford, who is known as the father of decision analysis. Ron analyzed everything from whether he should ride his motorcycle and incur a 1 in a million chance of death. And I used the same framework later to work out whether I should run with the Bulls in Pamplona. To make sure that we all understood and internalized some of the concepts that he taught in class, he even changed the way that we went about taking the tests. Everybody knows how to take a multi-choice test, A, B, C, D. But Ron made us assign probabilities to those tests, so that if you didn't know what the answer was going to be, you would assign a 25% chance to A, to B, to C, to D, and you would effectively get a 0 on that question. If you were 100% sure that the answer was A, and that was in fact the correct answer, you would score 1 on the test. But here's where things got interesting. There were real asymmetric downside consequences. If you assigned a probability of 100% to A and it was not A, then you would score negative infinity on that question. And by implication, you would score negative infinity on that test and for the class overall. So in other words, really messing up one question could mess up your whole entire quarter in that class. And this was how he demonstrated the idea of asymmetric risk. All of this has been on my mind because as a follow-up to the talk that I gave at Ad Monsters 6 months ago, one of the things I talked about was the idea of where is AI going to have an evolution in ad tech? Where is it going to have a revolution? And where is it too early to tell? And the moniker that I used and the graphic that I used is shown on screen, but it was this idea of, is there going to be potholes in the car? Because maybe the cars are self-driving, but if there's potholes in the road that we don't know about, somebody's going to trip over them or the cars are going to drive into them. So all of this was on my mind as we talked about how AI is going to change the risk profile for our industry. AI done well should eliminate a lot of day-to-day normal risks. And here I'm talking about the things where there's a typo in an operational line or a pixel gets mismatched and so a campaign is not running as effectively as it should. Those are the kinds of things that with the right AI checks in place, we should see dramatically reduce. But what I'm asserting is that AI significantly increases the existential risk, meaning the idea that without the proper oversight, a company could go potentially quickly bankrupt and even drag down others within the industry. So AI is going to reduce the idea of small operational risks, but potentially increase some of the more significant ones. So one of the examples of this is media math. When media math, and this is by the way not an AI example, but media math filed for bankruptcy, the industry faced immediate unresolved questions about counterparty risk, exposure, and companies had to quickly scramble to work out where they stood. But this is what I would call an everyday normal business risk. This is the kinds of things that mature industries have processes around counterparty risk, and there are well-defined procedures. In our industry, in digital media, digital advertising, ad tech, we don't have good procedures around those kinds of things. So we have to learn from other industries. And other industries are already seeing some of the early signs of problems with AI. A few examples. One is that Air Canada in 2024 had a chatbot on its site that was offering a bereavement to one of its customers who was asking about could he fly, and it had details on the bereavement policy. Unfortunately for Air Canada, those details were inconsistent with the bereavement policy on the rest of its website. Air Canada tried to defend itself by saying that the correct policy was listed on the website, but a judge found that a reasonable customer would trust the AI just as much as the text on some other part of the website. So the implication was that the AI output can incur contractual liability. A second example of AI incurring significant downside risk is an algorithmic example where Zillow launched a whole iBuying division associated with buying and selling houses. Unfortunately for them, there were some assumptions built into the algorithm that were completely incorrect and meant that that business went upside down very, very quickly and incurred a lot of losses, and that division of Zillow ultimately had to get shut down. And the lesson there was that a model error at scale can actually amplify the losses that you can incur within your business. And then the third example was Microsoft Hey, the chatbot that Microsoft launched and then within a few hours had to take down because the chatbot was learning from the people that it was interacting with and creating offensive and toxic content. And the lesson here is that feedback loops can degenerate very quickly in some of these systems. What's an example that can occur within our industry? There are a number. One of the examples is that in our industry, historically, there's been a very strong link between human decisions where the intent was clear and accountability was clear. So pricing, targeting, deal approvals, some of these might be machine assisted, but at the end of the day, it's been very clear that there's a person who's responsible for this. As we move into a world of AI, we're going to have AI agents coordinating with each other without potentially a person in the loop. They are potentially going to be optimizing without understanding, and they are potentially going to be acting without a clear owner. And so let's think about some of the ways that the agents can be interacting. One is the deployment of illegal creatives at scale. Right now, most creatives are going to go through some kind of human review where a person is going to look at them. As we move into a world where millions of creatives are going to be generated by AI, it's not going to be feasible for a person to review every one of those. If there is offensive or illegal content that is generated and deployed at scale, that creates the opportunity for a massive downside risk. Another is the idea that these AI systems are currently not set up to deal with many of the regulations, in particular privacy settings, GDPR in Europe, and other things that exist that we're aware of, but the AI systems are not well configured for. So the potential exists for a violation of those terms of service. A third might be the signing of contracts with unlimited liability. And the fourth is unknowingly targeting of protective user classes. Again, these are all things that can occur in the industry right now, but with the right controls in place, we steer away from. And if you talk to people behind closed doors, we're already seeing the early signs of these types of problems occurring. So let me speak to an example I know all too well, which is the idea of where you need to stand on pricing and pricing collusion. It is why I am the yield doctor. So historically, if there were companies that were accused of pricing collusion, you could usually point to an in-person meeting that occurred where one company either met with another one, exchanged some kind of communication, and pricing started to move within the industry. What many of us are concerned about is that in an AI first world, we start to see the AI agents start to make pricing decisions that look like pricing collusion. And so obviously there could be a couple of different flavors of this, and one that I call implicit and the other explicit. The implicit one is simply that the independent models learn to avoid pricing competition. And so both on the publisher side and the demand side, but particularly on the publisher side, they may start raising or protecting prices in what appears to be a coordinated manner, even though no actual signals may be exchanged. The more explicit is if the agents start to talk to each other without human oversight and coordinate to raise the prices. Again, that would be an example that by today's definitions would constitute pricing collusion. So the idea that regulators could look at this behavior, decide that it looks like coordinated price manipulation, and say that the owners of those systems allowed pricing coordination behavior to occur. All right, so what I've talked, hopefully by this stage in the talk, I have scared you all silly about some of the downside risks that can occur. What are the potential controls that we as leaders in organizations can start to put in place? And what I would advocate for is a multi-layer, in this case 3 decision layers that need to be put in place. One is a configuration layer where the decisions are worked out as to who owns each process. A second layer is around the acceptable risk thresholds so that we set limits, set constraints, and work out what would trigger an exception. And then the third is ensuring that all of the processes have reversibility and audit trails. And so let's go through those one by one. The configuration layer first is a pretty simple idea. It's the idea that for every process you have, there is an owner, and that owner either needs to be a person with their name against it, or maybe it's a functional role within your company. But it's the idea that if you've got a process, whether it's a bidding logic, budget allocation, optimization objectives, it's not sufficient to say it's a software process, it was just running. You need to have someone who understands both how it's running and how the inputs and outputs work and when things start to deviate from acceptable parameters. The second layer is the idea of acceptable risk thresholds. You cannot define or you cannot deploy AI faster than you can contain it. And so you need to work out what the failure boundaries are. So you don't pilot an AI system and then sit back and say, oh, things don't look very good, I wonder what's going wrong. In advance of deploying your system, you establish what the thresholds are going to be, where you would throw a red flag and say, this is outside of our common operating procedures. We need to pause the AI, we need to reconfigure, we need to shut it down. And so this whole layer is about defining the exact triggers for the automated systems to stop and working out when humans need to step in. And then the third layer is this idea of reversibility and audit trails. If a system is in place and it goes rogue, you need to be able to work out how to stop it and reverse it. And one of the things at the Programmatic.AI conference that was talked about is common practice now in a lot of agencies is as they bring a campaign live, they're taking screenshots all along the way of here's what the campaign setup looked like, here's the creative live. They're proving and demonstrating that everything is correctly configured. We don't necessarily always do that on the publisher side, but this idea that either you need audit logs sitting behind the scenes, or as simple as taking a series of screenshots to ensure that every process is working, you need to work out how you're auditing what's going on, and just as importantly, how to reverse it. And the reverse, unfortunately, is not going to be as easy as a software rollback. For those of us who have been around through a lot of enterprise software, you know if there's a problem with the current release, usually you're going to be able to roll back if it's a very major change. It's not clear that we are going to have the same processes in place to be able to roll back to previous versions. If not, we need to have a process in place for that too. So, the control layer requires that there is a human failure mode expertise. And one of the things that I think is a common misconception in the industry is that the control layer is purely software. In fact, we need human-in-the-loop operators to supervise the software, and we need to be able to detect when the AI confidently outputs something that is wrong. One of the challenges we have is that a number of companies right now are trying to cut their way to efficiency and saying that it's all about AI efficiency. In practice, what we are going to see is that the people who can catch when the AI is doing things it shouldn't do are some of the people that are currently being undervalued. We need experienced operators, and there is a real danger that we are cutting the ladder out so that we don't have those operators around in our companies. Experienced operators are going to become more valuable, not less valuable in the medium term, because we need people to oversee these processes. And I'm not seeing a lot of companies stepping up to put those people in the right roles. In fact, it's usually looked at that there is just efficiencies to be had. Maybe there are down the road, but we need to look at how do you actually get to a more efficient place before you start to think about reducing the type of oversight and control. The idea that you can cut your way to AI oversight, again, you're not going to get there through a depleted talent pool. So one of the ways that you want to deploy your AI software is by allowing some experimentation and then thinking about your production systems. And so there are two tracks here. What I've just been calling pilots, you could call the frontier track, where what you're trying to do is learn quickly, discover what's next, work out the most efficient ways of deploying AI within your company. This is an experimentation path. It is not a production path. You want to fast follow with something that is safe, reliable, that has controlled impact. That's where you deploy what you've already experimented with. So the key takeaway here is AI should not roll out everywhere throughout your organization all at once. You need to have a phased approach to it, and you're going to deploy different pieces of your AI architecture at different times. The frontier track, again, built for discovery and experimentation. You're going to have strictly bounded pilots. You're going to have tight operational guardrails, and you're going to have humans in the loop to look at the output. So the fact that it's experimentation and pilot doesn't mean you're running with no controls and no oversight. It just means that you are limiting the impact. You are very strategic about what you're doing in each of these situations. Once you have confidence in that sub-process, you can follow up with a fast follow track. And so if you look at the graphic, those learnings from your pilot get incorporated used in conjunction with the right decision control layer that uses all the things that I've been talking about, and you start to get to a scaled deployment for things like pricing, negotiation, bidding, etc. As we come to the end of this talk, it's been a little bit depressing thinking about all the things that can go wrong. And the thing to take away is, what can you do right now? And there's two main boxes here. One is implement the control layer, and the other is implement two different strategies. The control layer is about configuration authority, defining acceptable risk thresholds, and ensuring that you have reversibility and audit trails. Then the strategy to implement is around a frontier model where you do your pilots and your experimentation, not in production, but then you fast follow into production ready systems. The companies that are going to win in the AI era are not going to be the ones that deploy AI the fastest. They're going to be the ones that deploy at machine speed while maintaining control of those processes. I'm James Deaker. I am the Yield Doctor. Thanks for watching. Please join me next time.